Welcome to the Iron John Podcast, a production of the Minnesota Men's Conference. In this episode, we'll be sharing a story that was carried into the 2024 Winter Minnesota Men's Conference, the tale of Gwion, Bach and Ceridwen. The recording of the story is from the conference, and you will hear me, Walton Stanley, and Ben Dennis carry the story. Ben is with me today, and we'll do a little discussion and unpacking of the story. Ben and I have been working on story together for about 12 years now, I think. So welcome, Ben.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for doing this. It's a pleasure.
So, the first question I wanted to ask is kind of why this story at this time, and what is it that drew you to this story? And I have my ideas of my own, but I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, a couple of things that are really interesting for me, and the first, I'll just say this: in general, the nature of story when we bring narrative to play in these kinds of conferences where we have men gathered in a circle, opening themselves up to the possibility of a way of listening to the way the world works through these myths and stories that we carry. There's something living that happens. It reflects the society that we're in now, as well as many generations back. This particular story touched me from a couple of different layers. One was the images really spoke to me about what it was like to be a young person in this world, and the things that we're confronted with, presented with, and the opportunity to move forward in life. Another layer is sort of the mystical nature of the world, and really passionately engaged with when synchronistic things happen, what unfolds, what's being invited. In this particular story, when it came, really spoke to me about the invitation that the world gives us when we have the opportunity to open ourselves up. So I think you were the one that introduced me to this one, and I got to say thank you, Walton. It was a good story to choose.
Yeah, thanks. For me, I think a couple things. One is I always feel like stories put themselves forward in some strange way for these conferences. So the stories, it feels very much like the stories choose us rather than us choosing the story. In this case, I think the thing that struck me was there's a moment in the story where the protagonist, Gwion Bach, title character, is actually devoured. He's devoured by this powerful feminine, powerful sorceress. And then ultimately, as we'll see in the story, kind of reborn. And there was something about that somewhat unheroic process of being devoured and reconstituted that I thought was important in this at this time for men to hear.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that, because I've noticed this thing about it's life, everything, and then there's death, and then there's a kind of rebirth or a being born again from a perspective of transformation. It's a real
And in many ways, as we'll see in Gwion Bach, he is essentially born three times in the story, or it's implied that he's thrice born, which is a really interesting dynamic, I think.
So yeah, when you start looking at the numbers of transformations and how it unfolds in the story, and the counterpoint between Gwion Bach and his hesitate to use a word like nemesis or anything, because there is not a dialectic in there, but his counterpart in the other young man that was in the story, who was unable to step forward in that particular moment, where Gwion Bach was. There was a kind of birth in that process. And then the implications of that, what drove him through to ultimately being devoured, and what it might mean for those of us that have lived life, which all of us have. How many devourings have we gone through in our own life? How many times have we died and been reborn?
All right. Well, I think we will step into part one of the story, and after that, we'll come back and talk about that. So, there was, and there is, and there will be, and there's yet to come, and there has been an island in the middle of a misty sea. It's an island that has had many names spoken by different tribes of people. Some of them called it Alba, a white island, and some called it Albion. At times it was called the Isle of the Mighty, and at other times it was called Ceridwen. And that word, Ceridwen, was set upon the anvil of the human palate and hammered by human tongues until its shape was changed into the word we call it today, which is Britain, the name of that island. And in the west of that island, there's a land called Cymru, also known as Wales. And part of that land is called Poe. And in that region, long ago, there was a king who was a giant, and his name was Tegid the Bald. Now, a little south of Tegid's kingdom, there was another land, a lesser king, who paid tribute to Tegid. And his name was Gwythno Garanir, Gwythno the long-legged, the crane king. And it's a good thing he was a crane king, because his land was very low-lying. It was right on the sea, and it was very low-lying, and at times, if the sea was high and storms were in, they had to close the sea gates and have sea walls to keep the land from flooding. And it's said that one time, many years after this story, that one of his servants got drunk on duty and left the sea gates open and the land flooded. So that now, if you were to stand in Gwythno Garanir, the Crane King's great hall, you would find yourself standing in the middle of Cardigan Bay. We'll get back to Gwythno at a later time. Now, Tegid Full, the great king, the giant of a king, his land was all around an area called Lake Bala, and it went all the way down to the sea. And Tegid Full had a wife. He had a queen. Her name was Ceridwen, and she was the most powerful medicine woman in that land. She was gifted with the arts of magic, of enchantment, and of divination. And they had children, Tegid Full and Ceridwen. They had a daughter named Cryri, and Cryri was a shiningly beautiful girl. She was blessed with charm and wit and the brilliant art of conversation, and everyone lit up when they saw her. And they also had a son. Tegid and Ceridwen had a son whom they named Morfran, Great Crow Morfran. And as beautiful and charming and well-liked as his sister was, well, Morfran was just the opposite. He was repulsive to look at. People avoided staring at him if they could. And he had a strange, dark complexion, and he didn't wash very often. And he stayed away from people. And he always wore black, and he hung in the shadows. Now, he wasn't unintelligent. He had the heart of a poet within him. But there was something about his speech. Perhaps his voice was wounded in some way. His voice was also repulsive to people. They said, and said truly, that his voice, the sound of it, reminded people of the squawking of crows when they fed upon a corpse. And the words he used, and the phrases, and the way he put things, and the moments he chose to say things that seemed somehow weirdly inappropriate was very off-putting, and people couldn't understand the metaphors and the language that he used.
So, Morfrin, he would stand outside only when the sun was obscured by the darkest of clouds. Even the light of a fire, such as this one, would cause him to shrink. He pulled his cloak over his head everywhere that he went and pulled himself down. And I invite you to find that place in your body. Dip your head down and imagine what it's like to walk through life like this, crouched. Like an old spindly crow or a cormorant in its last legs. That's what this young man walked like. And maybe you've seen someone like this walking in the world. Some young man, maybe. So needless to say, Ceridwen, his mother, was anxious. And when Morfrin reached that age that he might go and be invited into society to be introduced as the young prince of the land, she thought to herself, there's no way that this is possible, not in this condition. I must do something. I must do something to transform him. And being the magician that she was, being the sorceress that she was, she went deeply into her magic. She dove deep into the underground tomes that she kept. She traveled in her spirit world searching for some answer. And finally, in an old, battered book deep in the basement of the castle that she lived in, she found a book. And inside that book, she divined a formula that, if properly prepared, this formula could transform her son into someone who would be beautiful and welcomed and powerful in the kingdom. And so she also looked deep. She wasn't sure until she found the oracle. There was an oracle in that same book that said that if you do this, your son will be honored in all of the land. So she went back into the world that we live, and she took out her cauldron of inspiration. This is a magic cauldron, a powerful cauldron. It was a vat that allowed her to create the most profound potions and magic known in this world. And she went out into the land, and she gathered the herbs at just the right time of year. She plucked the berries from the very special plants. She reached underneath the leaves for those rhizomes and those mushrooms. And she found the elements. And she brought all of those together. And she took her cauldron and all of the things that she had gathered to a meadow near the lake, a quiet place. And she laid the wood out for a fire. She put the elements into the cauldron, and she added the waters from a sacred spring. And she lit that fire. And she began that process. Now, she's a queen. She had responsibilities. And she knew that whatever she did with this cauldron, she needed help. And so she looked through her sight and she divined that she needed, the help that she needed was nearby. So she went to a nearby village and she found an old man named Morda. Now, Morda knew about fire, he knew about wood, he knew how to handle these sorts of things. And she also found a young man because this pot needed to be stirred day and night without stop for a year and a day. And at the end of that year and a day, it would only take 3 drops of what she was creating that would instill the gift of insight to whomever received it. And so Morda and the young man, Gwion Bach, she tasks them to tend the fire and stir the pot. And so the fire was started, and old Morda was feeding firewood into that fire, and Gwion Bach was stirring the fire, stirring that pot, stirring the liquid inside of there. And old Morda, as he fed these fires, the fumes that came off were so caustic, and they were so thick. The aromas that came off that were such that he began squinting his eyes closed. And after only a month, he kept his eyes closed, never to open them again during that entire year ahead of him. Gwion Bach, however, as he was stirring that pot, standing over there, bringing that large ladle around and around, could see the swirling inside there various colors and shapes until they began to become lands and places and events that were just barely out of focus. He didn't know if this was from the far past, the far future, or present day, only a different world. But as he stirred and as he stirred, his imagination began to grow, and so he started telling himself stories to keep himself awake. He created poems in verse to try to frame what it was that he was seeing. And he imagined songs singing through his head. And these were the things that Gwion Bach did to keep himself awake while he stirred that cauldron.
And so the time passed. They started that cauldron around this time in the winter. And they stood around that fire all winter long, feeding the fire, stirring the pot. Ceridwen would come by now and again and add some ingredient that had spoken to her in the forest and wanted to jump into that pot. She would bring that thing there. And Gwion Bach continued to stir the pot. He stirred it all through the spring and into the summer. Day and night, they fed that fire. They kept that pot at a steady boil, and they continued to stir it all through the summer rains, into the fall, and then finally, again, back into the winter. They stirred the pot until finally, at last, the year and the day had passed, and it was the day at which the potion would be ready for Morfra to receive. Ceridwen brought her son Morfra out to the fire to be ready to receive that elixir, that potion that would transform him into the man she hoped he would be. He slunk away from the fire, as was his wont. Ceridwen remembered something. She went back to the palace for something. Maybe it was for some new clothes for her son, for after his transformation, some beautiful, shining royal robes he could cast off that black that he always wore. She went back. And it was just at that moment that in that cauldron, a large bubble appeared. Now, Gwion Bach was still stirring the pot. He had stirred it for a year and a day, and he'd never seen a bubble like that appear in that pot. The bubble had all the colors of the rainbow swirling in it, filled with medicine and power. Gwion Bach was entranced. And he walked around that cauldron to see the other side of that bubble. And as he did so, he brushed past Morfrin, who was standing there. And then the curiosity got the better of him, and he took that stir stick and he broke the bubble. And when he did, 3 drops of that scalding hot potion landed on his hand. And he immediately, like we all would, stuck his hand in his mouth. And 3 drops of that potion went into him instead of into Morphin. And instantly, he was filled with knowledge and power and insight. He could see the great spiral of the future extending out forever. And he could also see the great spiral of the past going the other way forever into the past. And he saw how the future and the past were wedded together. He saw how he was a great, 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 great grandson of the stars. He saw the great web of being and all the places within that web of being. He understood the language of every being, of everything, the rocks, the mountains, the birds, the trees. He was overwhelmed with insight. And that's where we will leave him tonight.
So I'll just jump in here and just say that one of the things that we do in these conferences, for those of you that have been there, we feed the story. We let the images ride inside of us. And real importantly, I think we make the invitation to let that come into our bodies, what touches us. And a couple things for me that were really important about this first part of the story was your beautiful positioning of this story in geography. I really felt like we put ourselves in the land. That we don't live life away from the land. And so you did that, plus you put in by giving us that place of standing in Cardigan Bay, you oriented us in time. So there's both a timed nature of the story as well as a timelessness. So that's kind of the first thing. And then as we move into the characters and the unfolding of who the people are, that the story itself starts to unfold. But I find myself really, really intrigued by this idea of place and space, geography, orientation, territory. And I think those are important things. And when they let those touch our bodies, I think we can find our own storied places that we, in our own lives that we get to share, both with ourselves, with others, and in this case, in the feeding of a story like this.
I think that's right, and I think also it carrying place in stories, the stories arising out of a specific place, means that those places have their own enchantment. There's a story associated with that place, with that mountain, with that bay, with that stream, and I think that aids greatly in keeping a reciprocal and animated relationship between the human and the extra human, or the non-human, the other than human, our other relatives, if you will. And I think when stories become rootless, or we don't understand kind of where they are, something is lost in that, and also the places themselves become disenchanted.
Right. And that's part of what we do here is we're re-enchanting both the places that we live with and the places within us.
Right.
Because, I mean, traditional peoples have lived with an enchanted sense of the world that they live in always. And this is something we have to strive to reconstitute and regain for ourselves. The enchantment never went away, but our awareness of it maybe has. And so this is an invitation back at the idea of an invitation to allow that re-enchantment to occur.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another thing that I was really struck with was this image of these different characters. Ceridwen, for example, I mean, she's a pretty imposing character, you know, and Gwion, you know, that almost iconic beauty, and then Morfrin. And I have felt that in my body of being stooped, hiding from the light, whether physically, actually, or metaphorically, of not wanting to be seen, and some deep wound that I carried inside of me, and that was so painful to have to hold in my body during the telling of the story, and at the same time it needed to be told. So,
And I think Morfran is a almost a case study for a lot of young men find themselves these days. They are not stepping out. They're, you know, wearing the dark hoodie, wearing, you know, being staying, you know, hidden, if you will. And I think some of that is appropriate. There's you know, his association, Morfrin's association with darkness, with black, with kind of an ashy, you know, lunar kind of a way of being. I think that's an important stage that we all have, that kind of ashy place that men in particular, I think, need to go through in some way.
Well, I mean, it's traditionally it's the time of the ashes. It's the place where the teenagers go next to the fire, where they're not allowed to be with the family unit, but they're also not allowed to be out into the world on their own. So they go to the place of the ashes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I add one more thing in there, and that's that the nature of time. This is a story that was told how many generations ago? In a place that doesn't even exist physically anymore because it's underwater, and yet here we have a young man that's in a hoodie that's hiding from the world, just like the kid down the street today. So it's both pertinent for the moment, and it's something that's timeless.
Right.
So that's really important.
Yeah. Yeah, the impulse within the psyche hasn't changed in 20,000 years or.
So another part that really struck me was this the relationship between the fire carrier Morda and Gwion Bach.
Yeah.
Where Morda's poking that fire, and the caustic nature of those fumes are so much that he has to close his eyes. He's the elder, and in the presence of that circle, his eyes are squeezed shut. And how many elders do we see out there who have closed their eyes to the nature of that transformative nature of things? And then you've got Gwion Bach, who's so utterly fascinated with it, he can't stop looking. So really different ends of the spectrum. And then his stirring of that pot, constant stirring of the pot, talk about a metaphor for a young man out there in his creative juices.
Yeah, stirring the pot.
Those of us that if we can remember that place in us, it's like, boy, those eyes they'll pry our eyes open, and we can find that again, and that's an amazing place to be.
Yeah, and I think that's something you see in a lot of people too, that they, you know, confront old family patterns and things as they're coming into adulthood. They stir that pot. They say things out loud that people don't necessarily want to hear. That's all part of stirring the pot, right?
And what's happening in the world right now is that the old legislators, if you want to call them that, are trying to shut down this commentary about what's in the world. They don't want that pot stirred because it's going to disrupt the status quo.
Right. It's the old tension between the cynics and the
puer and the cynics.
Yeah, the old. If the cynics becomes hardened and calcified, then you get that kind of tyrannical, oppressive, moralistic.
Yeah. Well, and I love that you've got standing next to this cauldron, you've got both Gwion Bach, who's snatched those 3 drops and they burn, and he sticks them in his mouth.
Yeah.
And in that burning and in that sticking in his mouth and that willingness to have his hands in there, the transformation is there. No, not at all.
And with that, let's move on to the second part of the story.
Such a strange time to be coming in a circle like this, to be reminded of that place that's far across that great ocean. Do you remember that island that we told of the last time we gathered? And you remember that there was a Lake Tegid, that was ruled over by the bald king, Tegid IV. And he had a queen, a beautiful sorceress, Ceridwen. And that she had 2 children. The 2 of them had 2 children. Ceridwen, a beautiful young maiden, and Morfrin, the crow, the one whose head hung low. And you remember that Ceridwen decided that she needed to do something about his condition, and so she created this potion, the potion of Awen, giving the gift of insight if 3 drops were to be taken at just the right moment. You remember that? A year and a day that it must be stirred, not let the boiling continue for a year and a day. Do you remember that? And do you remember that at the appointed time, when Morda, the old man, had kept the fires going and Gwion Bach had stirred for a year and a day, that the appointed time came for Morfrin to come and take the medicine? Do you remember that? And do you remember what happened then? That at that moment, when Ceridwen was away on a short errand, just a few moments away from the cauldron, that the bubble burst and 3 drops touched Gwion Bach on the hand? You remember that? And you remember what he did then with that burning? He put the 3 drops into his mouth. You remember that? And you remember that he, in that instant, the inspiration, the gift of inspiration struck him, and he could see up into the sky, down into the earth, and all around. He could see the old time and the future times. You remember that? And do you remember that instant that he gained this power of insight, divination, and transformation, that he was able to then access much more than other human beings? You remember that? And so Gwion Bach, in those moments, as he reveled in that instantaneous explosion of inspiration and knowledge and awareness, he received his first prophetic vision. In that vision, he could see Ceridwen, the queen, the mother of Morfrin, come, see what had happened, and explode in rage. And he knew in that moment, his prophetic vision gave him the insight to know that his life, his very life, was at stake. So Gwion Bach, using his newfound power, leapt up from that cauldron, leaving the stick that stirred that potion for a year and a day right inside there, leapt up, and he transformed himself into a hare. And he leapt from that meadow, and as fast as he could on his new furry legs, raced down the hill to the west. trying desperately to get away from what he knew his fate might be. Meanwhile, that pot, that sacred cauldron, that cauldron of inspiration, the fluids stopped turning. And as it grew still, the fires underneath, continuing to be fed by blind Morda, by the old blind man who had had his eyes squeezed shut for a whole year, he kept feeding the fires because he had no idea what else to do. The bottom began to burn. And as that liquid inside began to burn, something foul started to occur. And there was a great shaking and a great crack, and the cauldron of inspiration cracked right there. And the liquid began to pour out onto the ground and making its way down the hill towards the lake. It infused that lake with that new toxic material, that poison. And the poison was so great that the next day, 25 miles away, down a river that was fed from that lake, Gwion here, you remember him? Gwion here had brought his finest horses to the river to drink. And as those horses waded in and sipped on that water, each one of them died in an instant. And Gwion here let out a howl. That's how poisonous that potion had become. Back when Ceridwen had returned to the meadow to bring her son Morfrin to take those 3 drops of inspiration and gift and give him all that he would need to be a beautiful and blessed man in the kingdom, she arrived and instantly she could see that there was something terribly wrong. And her eyes flew open and she looked everywhere. And she could see Morfrin standing behind an olive tree or a holly tree, hiding in the shadows. And she reached over and she grabbed hold of him and she said, "What happened?" And Morfrin, nothing came out of his voice. And she pushed him back. And in that moment, Morfrin took steps back, looking at his mother, whose rage had turned her back to him. And in that instant, he took on a new name for himself. Afat, the utter darkness. And he turned for that. And Ceridwen went to Morda, the old man who had been tending the fire, and watched for a moment as he kept poking at this fire, this useless fire. She reached out, she grabbed him, and she slapped him so hard across the face that his eyes flew open. And he didn't even need to hear the question. He just simply said, "The boy! It was the boy! It's his fault!" And Ceridwen's eyes flew around, and she could see with her sight, her magic sight, she could see the hair that was Gwion Bach racing down the hill. And she saw him. And she transformed herself into a great gray hound, and she leapt after him in amazing leaps and bounds and speed, chasing after this hare until she was almost on him. And Gwion Bach, as he's racing this way and that way down the hill, comes to a river, the river Gwion. And sensing the hot breath on his tail, leapt into the air and made that turn, just as the hound did the same thing. And as he leapt and began that arc down, he transformed himself into a salmon, hit that water and began swimming downstream as fast as he possibly could. In the same instant, Ceridwen transformed herself into an otter. And as she splashed in, she too swam as fast as she could. And down the river they went. Until finally, Gwion Bach could feel the claws of the otter on his tail. And he made a dive down deep and then sprung up, leapt out of the water, and stretched his fins out into wings and turned into the thrush, the interpreter of omens, and flew high in the sky. And Ceridwen, realizing that he is gone, could see the bird flying, leapt herself up out of the water as an otter, and as she reached the air, she turned herself into a great falcon, and in powerful beats of her wings flew high. Using her falcon eyes, she could see that thrush winging its way through the branches and the trees and trying to get away from her, and she dove, and her claws outstretched, ready to crush him. And as she was almost on him, he was making a turn this way, and below he could see a farm. And in the instant before her claws struck, Gwion Bach disappeared.
Now, in fact, Gwion Bach didn't actually disappear. What had happened is that when he looked down at that farm below, he could see that the people had been threshing wheat, and there were a lot of grains of wheat still there on the ground, scattered all around, hundreds of grains of wheat. So what he did was transform himself in midair from a thrush into a grain of wheat, and he dropped down amongst all the other identical grains. And Ceridwen, with her falcon eyes, also saw what happened. And the falcon dove down right into that farmyard, but before the falcon landed, she transformed herself into a tufted black hen and began pecking wheat. And she pecked grain after grain like the hungry hen she was. And at last she came to the grain that was Gwion Bach, and she devoured him. And the story might end there, but it doesn't. So Ceridwen resumed her human form and went back home and went about her business. Now it so happened that during all this time, the time she'd been making the potion that year and a day, her husband, Tegid Fol, had been out of the country on some foreign business, and he was still away for some time. And so it was with some surprise to Ceridwen when she recognized in herself the signs and the symptoms that she was with child. For she had not lain with her husband nor any man for over a year. And as she was a medicine woman and she had sight, she could divine that what had happened was that seed she ate, Gwion Bach, that rascal boy who had ruined the potion, was now growing within her as a child. And she vowed that when that child was born, she would destroy it. And so the sun rose and set, the days and the weeks passed by, and the months. And it came time. It came to the autumn time. And her time to bring the child forth came, and she went into labor. And she birthed that child. The child was a radiant, shining, beautiful, perfect baby boy. And when Ceridwen held that boy that she'd just birthed, she had taken a vow to destroy the child. She couldn't bring herself to do it. Nor could she bring herself to order her men to kill the child. But she'd vowed to destroy it, so what she did was this. she laid the child in a coracle. A coracle is a round framed boat with a hide hull, a hide cover on it. It was used in those times. She laid the child on some blankets in a coracle. And then she took another coracle, a round boat, and she laid this on top, kind of like a clamshell. And then she sewed the two coracles together, caulked the seam. And she took this coracle down to the sea, and she put it out on the outgoing tide. And she watched to make sure it was being taken out into the sea. And then she turned her back, and without looking back, she walked away. And that's where we will leave them for now.
Well, this, I'm jumping in here again. We talked about the poison that rolled down there, the assault on the king of the land, that his horses dying. It's like everywhere that I've been, horses are always a helpmate and a vehicle to help us transcend the limitations of the physical world here. It wasn't until horses came that the relationship between mankind, men and horses, that we were really able to begin moving in the world in a much more dynamic way. And to have those horses die from this inspiration, I don't really look at it as like, yes, it's poison. Yes, it's horrendous. The power of what was created in that cauldron of inspiration is deeply characterized by that event. But it also, I think, implicates a juxtaposition between the role of the horse is now transferred into Gwion Bach through the drops, through this light of inspiration, through his capacity to see into the other world, see into the future, see into the past, as well as transform himself into other beings. And that transformation into other beings is more than just a shapeshifter. He's actually able to transport his imagination and his sense of beingness in and look through those eyes.
Well, yes, and it's that connection to other forms of consciousness, to other relations, if you will, and really being connected with that. So, he can see through the eyes of a thrush, see through the imagination of a thrush, or of a seed, a grain of wheat, right?
But what a powerful thing that would be, to see through the eyes of a grain of wheat.
Yeah. And the ability to take all of that stored information and energy, and the ability to produce, tremendous abundance in that way, all encapsulated into that tiny grain, right?
I think we forget the wonder, the sheer wonder that, if you've ever seen a poppy seed, that itty bitty tiny little black speck can transform itself into a flower of beauty like that.
Yeah.
And I think that speaks back to what we were talking about originally with
and a enormously powerful drug.
That's true.
Yeah.
It should be, now that I've evoked that, it's probably worth noting that a drug that does a lot for pain relief and numbing of the mind. Or moving into a dream state, I don't know.
Yeah.
But just, this nature of moving, but then the conflict of Ceridwen also making those same transformations and chasing her.
Yeah.
What's coming up for me is a sense of that same struggle that a butterfly has getting out of a cocoon. It's a required, this chase, this flight for life is required movement for him in his larger journey. So, we how many people out there, they want to keep their kids away from the pain and suffering of life. When pain and suffering in life and conflict and the struggles that we all have trying to make it in this world, those are what free the imagination to be able to move into the different transformations that he made. He went from air, to land, to water, to sky,
Yep.
and to the sea. I mean, he did
Yep.
all of those.
Yep. The other thing is that he never. She remains more powerful. I mean, everything he transforms into, she becomes the predator of, essentially.
Yeah, right.
And eventually, she does devour him, which is pretty incredible when you think about it. To be, to be devoured by this powerful, magical, feminine force, and of course, then he's reborn through her, right? And so, her prophecy comes into being that she does give birth to a son with great insight and power and all that. It's just not the one she thought it was going to be.
Well, and I'm guessing that she wasn't the mother he thought he deserved. And we don't really know his backstory at all.
No, we don't know who his family of origin of the peasant boy Gwion Bach are. That we don't really know anything about it, but we know he is both, kind of taken the elixir of inspiration, has all this insight, and then there's the chase. He's devoured. He's done. He's ended, and then he's reborn again through her.
To shift cultures a little bit, he becomes the grist for the Baba Yaga's mortar and pestle.
Kind of, but then he becomes he comes through her again. It's the son reborn of that devouring mother.
And shining when he's born. What an image!
Yeah, transformed. Still
where her
full
killing rage goes away.
Yeah, and that's an interesting moment that she vows to destroy the child and she can't. Right. She looks at him. He's shining. He's absolutely beautiful and perfect. She's just birthed him, and so she sews him up in the coracle, which again is another womb, right? It's a leather boat. It's almost exactly like a uterus that when you sew two coracles together, and puts them back into the amniotic fluid of the ocean, right?
Exactly. I mean, the mare is sea, and so he goes out back into the sea to go into that dream time once again.
Yeah.
However, the story says 8 days, but we all know that sometimes that 8 days or 7 days or whatever, it could be 8 years, it could be 8 centuries, we don't know.
Yeah, there's versions of the story where they say he's gone for 40 years, and so, yeah.
And this is to go back to what we originally talked about with how salient and important these stories are for today. It's I recently heard somebody talk about it's like there's no such thing as not being able to learn something new. I was talking with a friend of mine here, and just now it says, well, learning a new language is really hard when you're in your 60s, and it's like, wait a second, it's not any harder than it was when I was 15. It's just that it's the task for today. And hardness or not hardness is projecting myself back in the past or trying to push myself into the future when the task is for today. And so when he's in, when Gwion Bach's in that coracle bouncing around the ocean, he's there as long as he needs to be.
Right.
Because he's in that space now in preparation for whatever comes next.
Right.
And so you see this trajectory of birth, initiation, if you will, transformation, and we're in this dark place of transformation. So we're waiting to see what has been we use this word initiation, and I think when we use it ritually, I think there's a tendency to forget that the word means the beginning.
Right. It's a start. Right.
Start. And so we're seeing the culmination in this part of the story at the beginning of who this person is going to be.
Yeah, and there are also many starts in life. It's not like you go through and finish. There are starts upon starts upon starts upon starts.
Exactly.
Well, with that, let's move on to the final part of the story.
Oh, here we are back again. And so Ceridwen, having left that coracle, that boat that she had sewed up that bag with a baby bag, out to sea, and her walking away, and in a moment she stops and realizes the oracle was correct. Her son did receive the gift. And she dropped her head, just not the son she wanted or intended. And so it was that coracle floated off to sea, and if anybody has seen the Irish Sea, they know that this is not gentle waters. And for 9 days and 9 nights, in the stormy waters of the Irish Sea, that space between Wales and Ireland, that channel of turbulent waters, that coracle floated back and forth, being pushed this way and that by the currents and the waves and the wind. And if we know anything about round boats, they are at the mercy of what they float in. And so this boat floated 9 days and 9 nights. And that's what we know right now. For see, in that kingdom, that small vassal kingdom of Gwion here, he still stewed over the deaths of his finest horses in that pointed poisonous river. And it threw a shadow over him. And as the time approached the fall festival of Samhain, it was said that during Samhain time, fortunes could change. That if you had bad luck, maybe your luck would change to good. And it was also said that if you went and gathered fish out of the fish traps, the weirs, that those would be the finest tasting fish, and the catch would be vast. And so knowing that the feast of Samhain was coming, Gwion here sent his son Elfin, Prince Elfin, to go gather fish out of the weirs. And see, Elfin was one of these other young men who it seemed that anything that he put his attention to didn't fare so well. And I'm sure we all know what that's like. And Elfin, trying this and that through the course of his life, never quite finding anything that he could do particularly well, was a little bit nervous. And so he went to the weirs, knowing that all of his father's courtiers were there, all of the elders of his people, everyone was waiting for him to bring the Feast of Salmon for them to eat on this festival, this fall festival time. And when he approached the first weir, now you understand that this is the time that the salmon run. This is the time that there are fish in abundance in the sea, and he approached that first weir with hope and expectation. And he looked inside there was nothing. And he went to the second weir, and there was nothing. And so it was, each place he went to, look, there was nothing. The weirs were empty. The weirs of the land of Gwion here were empty for the first time in memory. And with failing breath, with that sinking heart, with that heaviness of foot slogging through the waters to each of the fish weir, each of the fish traps, in hope of something to bring back to his father for their feast. Nothing, nothing, nothing. And finally there was one trap, one weir left to look at. And as he neared that final one that was far out into the waters, a little bit deeper than the others, he looked inside the trap, again, nothing. However, hanging on the edge, on one of the branches of that fish trap, he could see something round. And so he slogged out, he grabbed hold of this thing, this strange shape, round kind of clam shape, about this big around, and he drug it into shore. Curious as to the possibility that maybe there was something of value inside there. Maybe it was a bit of treasure that he could bring back to his father, something he could sell at market. And so he pried. He could see that it was glazed all around the edges and that there was sap caulking it closed. And so he pried, and as he opened it up, there, something shiny. And with a little bubbling in his heart, he opened it up further, and swaddled was a baby whose brow was just shining bright. It took his breath away, and he picked up this baby and just said, Taliesin, shining brow.
And to his amazement, the baby spoke and said, Taliesin he is. That shall be the name, and I do not deny it. And Elphin started to make his way back. He didn't quite know what to do, but he thought, well, he might as well take this shining little baby boy back with him. Couldn't very well leave it on the beach. So he placed it in the basket that was attached to his horse, the basket that he had hoped would be full of salmon. It was now empty except for this baby. And he got on his horse and he started making his way home. And he started imagining what his father would say when he gave him the news that he had fucked up yet again, and that he had brought no salmon back. For generations on Samhain Eve, the one who went out to check the weirs would bring back a load of salmon, and now he had failed even in this. While he was thinking these thoughts, the baby began to sing to him and to console him. The baby sang, Despair not, good Elphin, you're blessed today. A bard of great power has now come your way. Though no salmon you caught in good Gwyon's weir, a pearl of great value you have gotten here. By the tufted black hen was the serving boy slain, but now from the sea I am born again. The boy Gwion Bach was my former name, as Taliesin I will garner fame. And so Elphin took the baby Taliesin back to court. And when he arrived, he had to explain why he was carrying a baby instead of a load of fresh salmon. And his father began to berate him. But the baby spoke in his defense with bardic wisdom and with great insight, much to the amazement of the court, and stunned old Gwyon here into silence. And after that, Elphin took the baby home, and he and his wife raised that baby as their foster son, Taliesin. And after that moment, the fortunes of Elphin changed, and everything he touched, everything he turned his hand to and his eye to, seemed to prosper. And Taliesin went on and became the greatest bard in that land, including being the bard to Arthur himself. Now, as for Taliesin's half-brother, Morfront, the great crow, you might be wondering what happened to him. Well, as it turned out, Morfrin was the most faithful knight of Arthur. And it was him that had the honor and the distinction to survive the great battle that Arthur faced, the great battle of Camlan. It's said because he was so repulsive, no sword would harm him. He survived, and it was him that took Arthur to the lake for his final rescue. Now, you know, Taliesin had the ability to transform himself into any kind of being, into a tree, into a pond, into a river, into any animal. And for this reason, he would see animals and he would realize that they were beautiful because he could become that animal. And one day Taliesin was walking through the woods and he saw a vixen, a female fox. And to you or I, she might just seem a fox, but Taliesin could see she was gorgeous. And so he transformed himself into a fox. And he paid court to that vixen. And they had some wonderful times together. And he told this whole story of his origin to that fox, to that vixen. And so the story was carried by the fox people. And it was passed on from generation to generation of foxes. And that's why the story has sly and foxy wisdom within it. But one year, a young kit fox was out running around and he wasn't paying attention. And an eagle came down and hit him. He almost took him, almost picked him up in those claws, but the fox, though wounded, managed to slip out, and he went down into a burrow, went down into a den. But he was badly messed up, and he died in that fox den. And the story leached out of his bones when the rains came and went into the earth in that place. And it might have remained in the earth. It was there for hundreds of years. But centuries later, a squirrel came and buried a hazelnut right around that spot. And the hazelnut sprouted. And that hazel tree, the roots of that tree drew the story up into the tree. And it made the nuts of that hazel particularly sweet. And so people kept gathering those nuts and replanting them in other places and spreading them all around the world because they were the most delicious hazelnuts. And Ben and I, the other day, had a lovely hazelnut Danish, and the story went into us, and now we've told you. I think part of what's interesting in this final part is that we're taken to this other realm that we talked about, the Crane King's realm and that, and we meet another son who's a disappointment to his parent. Gwyon's son Elfin, in some ways mirrors Morfran being kind of a disappointment, right? And of course, he's the one that's sent out as this task, relatively simple, the salmon run, you put the weirs out, you're supposed to bring back a whole load of salmon, and then he gets there, and of course, the weirs are empty, except for this weird leather bag coracle thing he finds there.
I do want to say right now that how strikingly true it is that even something that is nature that you have no control over ends up being a point of failure.
Yeah.
And believe me, it's like I've been there, and I know plenty of people have been there. It's like, it's like you go outside to get some sunshine and it's raining. You can't even, you can't win for losing.
Yeah. And, of course, I think, many of us have felt that moment with our fathers.
Oh yeah.
Over the years of being somehow disappointments to them. I'm sure every son has experienced that at some moment, as has every father.
Mm-hmm. So you were saying about the bag.
Well, yeah. I mean, so this then when he opens the bag, it's almost it's the third birth, right? He's out of the sea. It's kind of a cesarean birth, if you will. He's cut out of the coracle. But this time, he is kind of fully conscious, fully who he is, and he. When the name is presented, the name Taliesin, the shining brow, when that is presented, he latches onto it. He takes that identity. He is now actually reborn as Taliesin, even though he's still an infant, right? He has essentially all the power in place at this point in the story.
Well, I also want to go back to Elfin in this moment, and I think this is another one of those things that mirrors life, is that none of us is going to go out there and actually find a leather bag on the beach that has a shining four-headed baby. But I would say that even in our darkest moments, the gift of what's possible, I don't know that it's a promise, but it certainly is something to consider. That even in this moment of, there's not a fish to be had. The feast at home, all the nobles are gathered, his father's waiting, there's not to be fish to had, and he shows up with what? But there's still a gift there.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets the metaphor or the how it relates to life can maybe becomes a little bit more tenuous. But at least there's that possibility. So, I guess maybe it's the hope in such a way that you don't give up.
Right.
And then he had to get together enough. How many different stories came where he dropped the baby off at an old fisherman's hut because there's no way that he could come back with a baby in a bag. And the story goes off in a different direction.
Yeah,
this particular story, he's willing to come back and confront the ridicule of all of the people, all of his father's guests, as well as his father, with this that he recognizes as a profound gift, as a profound boon for his kingdom.
Well, and I think there's a moment in a man's life where he realizes, Elfin essentially becomes his own man at that moment.
Right.
He takes his destiny becomes his own. He's not his father's disappointing son. He's just, he now has made this connection with this brilliant, enlightened light, shining being, even though it's an infant. But his, the story says from that moment on, his fortune changed. And essentially, you have to accept, I don't have to, I'm not the person my father wanted me to be. I'm the person I am.
Well, it's interesting. A couple of things come up from one is the word courage, because it takes courage for him to do, to come back there.
Yeah, face ridicule.
The word courage, the core is the root of the word courage, means of the heart.
Yeah.
So this is a move of the heart. And then it also brings me back to this for us to remember affect-do. And, how he was kind of, in the story, he kind of slinked off into obscurity at that point in this story. But it's important to remember that, courage still exists here.
Yeah.
And he became. But we could talk about that in a moment.
Yeah. Well, I think, I think it's right that you brought up, and I think this was your impulse to bring up the kind of history of Morfran. or the future of Morfran, if you will, in that he was the most faithful of Arthur's knights. He was the knight that was there at the very last after the Battle of Camlan, one of the few that survived, and he brings Arthur to the island to bury him and all of that. So Morfran actually has a great and significant destiny. It's just not the destiny that his mother thought would be his. He again,
Elfin, he became the man, not the man that his father wanted to be. He became his own man, and Morfran became the man, not the man that his mother wanted him to be.
Right, exactly.
I think these are really crucial distinctions to be made, both in reflection for us older men, as well as young men that are moving forward into life. Is that I don't think you should go searching for maybe just to. I'm not going to be anything like what everybody else wants to be, but really I think it's important to when the winds of change come. When the disaster comes, who inside of you, who really shows up?
Well, that, and you were talking about courage being of the heart, but it's also it's also of the core of your being, right? Like what is that really about? The other thing I wanted to say about Morfran is we of course find out that he's now the half brother of Taliesin. Right, they both now have the same mother, and that brother relationship between the shining brow, the Taliesin, and the utter darkness, I think is important, because without being able to look into the darkness, you can't see into the light. Without being able to look into the past, you can't see into the future, right? So all that kind of medicine, that kind of power that we're talking about, is dependent on a connection with that dark brother.
Right. And we don't know the relationship that Morfran and Taliesin had, but that you bring up that they're half brothers, I think is a really profound thing, because within the realm, because these are all constellations of the realm. Taliesin is the greatest bard. He has the insight necessary to hold this kingdom whole. And Morfran, as Afagdu, is the great warrior who's able to provide protection for King Arthur, in this realm, until the very end, until he's given into the arms of the ladies of the lake. And so, again, back to what I said earlier about the light and the dark not being at odds with each other, but rather being part of a constellation of these parts, if you will, that make it possible for this kingdom, this realm, to exist. And psychologically, it's the same thing. We don't allow ourselves to hold and deepen fully into the darkness of the depths of our soul, if you will, soul work, as it's called on. Then all of this, the light of inspiration, doesn't have anything to root itself in.
Right.
And so they're dependent upon each other to hold the gravity of who we are, the gravity of our identity.
Exactly. Well, Ben, thanks for being on today, and thank you for sharing the story and carrying it into the conference
and
together with me.
And beautiful job. Thank you so very much. And hopefully, going forward, what we've offered here is a invitation to look deeper within the images of the story. We have certainly not covered everything that can be covered by a long shot, but the invitation is there to deepen as much as possible and let these images carry us into the future.
Yeah. And also, like we say at the conference, see where in your body you feel a particular image as you remember the story. So.
Yep. All right. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Ben.
pale nyuma. Tulikuwa tusimame pale nyuma. Tulikuwa tusimame Mtito. Tulikuwa tusimame Mtito. Tulikuwa tusimame stop.